Now, I don't work for the police force, but from what I can see over the course of my lifetime, the police force has changed considerably. When I was a child, the police force was actually a force. There was a minimum height restriction in order to create an imposing presence that could maintain law and order, and the majority of the police were men, again to show that spirit of strength. The older generation will remember the days when a policeman would give you a clip round the ear if you were a misbehaving child, and the parents would support this rather than defend the child and run to a solicitor as they would do now. But over the course of time, that strength has weakened, and whereas once the police force would enforce the law, over the course of time they have transformed into having a much softer demeanour, much more like social workers, dealing with criminals through this so-called spirit of consent. And there are some reasons why the police force appears to have become weaker. Traditionally, the police have also been labelled as racist. However, my opinion on this is that the reality was that the police noticed that certain demographic groups were probably more likely to commit certain types of crime than others. The reasons for this probably depend on your politics. Left-wingers would argue that socio-economic disadvantages led to such demographic groups to need to turn to crime. And furthermore, these disadvantages were as a result of institutional racism in society in the first place. Right-wingers, on the other hand, would argue that those demographic groups are more likely to turn to those crimes because it was in their nature, their DNA. But the fact is that even if the police didn't treat different demographic groups differently, the very fact that they came into contact with the public so much created certain views based on what they saw and experienced, which was that different groups of people who differed along lines of race, nationality, politics, age or gender either maybe behaved in different ways or at least held different values. This is why the whole practice of stop and search was so controversial. Left-leaning politicians would state that black youths were being unfairly targeted due to institutional racism in the police force. The police, however, would maintain that they were simply targeting the demographic that from their statistics showed were more likely to carry knives and use them. Bear in mind that most of us socialise and interact with people who we have things in common with. Groups and friendships cluster around commonalities. Girls will hang around with girls, boys will hang around with boys, Muslims will spend their time with Muslims, black people will spend their time with other black people, white people will tend to spend their time with other white people, etc. We do not necessarily get first-hand experience of how diverse people can be, but the police do, and they will start to see the patterns that exist among people who share certain characteristics. But those who didn't do the job didn't take seriously the patterns that the police saw, or they were silenced by the politically correct ideologies of their masters. And as such, they were labelled as racist. As such, this is why diversity training in the police force is now taken so seriously, because the left-wing ruling elite wish to eradicate the perceived historical racism within the police force and teach them that everyone is the same. Whereas the reality is that the police have noticed that different groups share certain values and behaviours. As it stands now, the police force in the UK is permeated by an overbearing culture of political correctness, and a major response to these historical concerns of racism has been the creation of diversity targets in the police force, again weakening the police force by employing people who are not necessarily the best people for the job, but nonetheless tick a politically correct box. And then there is the advent of the mobile phone. Once there was a time when nobody carried a camera around with them. Now everyone has one in their pocket. As such, the police have to be very careful about what it is they do and say, because they know that anybody could be filming them, particularly those who seek to feel better about themselves by bringing down a peg or two those who are perceived to have more power than them. This is what has further weakened the police force, as police officers then feel circumspect when it comes to saying and doing what they want. That being said, the invention of the body cameras provided a counter to this for the police force, who are now able to provide objective evidence for what a member of the public has done or said, which can then be much more powerful evidence used in court than the mere account from a police officer of what was done or said. And let's face it, with all due respect to the police force, this testimony may not necessarily have always been true. If you are young enough to have never heard of the Guildford Four or the Birmingham Six, then Google them and you will see what I mean. But anyway, no disrespect to the police, they do a very good job under often very difficult and stressful conditions, and we need them. And anyone who complains about the police may feel differently if they ever need to seek their help. And that's not to say that some may not have abused their power, and like any profession that comes with a degree of power over others, it will attract bullies.